The morning Susan Sullivan found the first flower on her porch, she thought a child had placed it there as a prank. It was a single yellow wildflower, the kind that grew in patches along the creek bed about a quarter-mile east of her little house on the edge of Harlan's Creek, Texas. The year was 1878, and the town had barely grown past 24 buildings, most of them sagging under the relentless summer heat that pressed down on the panhandle like a hot iron on wet cloth. Susan stood in the doorway of her house that first morning, her dark hair loose around her shoulders because she had not yet pinned it up, and she stared at the flower lying across the worn wooden planks of her porch as though it might explain itself. She picked it up carefully, turned it in her fingers, and felt something move in her chest that she immediately pressed back down. Grief had a way of making small things feel enormous, and she could not afford to let a wildflower undo her before the day had even started. She had bread to bake, eggs to collect, a mule named Biscuit to feed, and a small plot of kitchen garden to water before the sun climbed high enough to scorch everything she had worked to keep alive since her husband Thomas had died 8 months ago. Thomas Sullivan had been a good man. Not a perfect one, but good enough that his absence had left a hole in Susan's daily life, so wide she sometimes stood in the middle of her kitchen and simply forgot what she had been doing. He had died in November, thrown from his horse during a fast ride back from the county seat, and the ground had been frozen by the time they buried him in the little cemetery at the edge of town, beside the crooked oak tree that marked the boundary between the churchyard and the open range. Susan was 31 years old. She had no children, though not for want of trying, and no family within 300 miles. What she had was a house that belonged to her free and clear, because Thomas had paid it off the year before he died, a small amount of savings, and a stubbornness that the women of Harlan's Creek both admired and occasionally found exhausting. She did not ask for help easily. She did not weep in public. She baked excellent bread and brought it to the church socials and smiled when people said she was holding up wonderfully, even when she felt like she was holding up the way a fence post holds up in a flood, barely, by sheer refusal to move. The flower she placed in a tin cup with some water and set it on the windowsill, where it lasted 3 days before it drooped. The second flower appeared 2 mornings later, and this one was not a single wildflower but a small bunch of them, tied with a strip of rough twine. Susan looked up and down the dusty road in front of her house, half expecting to catch someone in the act. But the road was empty in the early dawn light, just the pale dust and the sound of the wind moving through the sage. She brought the flowers inside, and this time she felt something that was harder to name than grief. It was almost like being seen. The sensation lasted about 10 minutes before she pushed it firmly aside and went about her day. She asked around, casually, the way a woman does when she does not want anyone to know she cares about the answer. She mentioned it to Alma Dearborn at the general store, keeping her voice light, saying something about how it was the strangest thing. Someone had been leaving flowers on her porch. Alma had raised her eyebrows and smiled the particular smile of a woman who has decided there is romance afoot and intends to find it. Susan immediately regretted saying anything. Could be one of the Lester boys, Alma said. The younger one has been mooning after every widow in 3 counties. He is 17 years old, Susan said flatly. 17 is old enough to have feelings, Alma said cheerfully. Susan bought her flour and her salt and left before Alma could say anything else. The flowers kept coming. Every morning without fail, when Susan opened her front door, she found something waiting. Sometimes it was the yellow wildflowers from the creek. Sometimes it was a cluster of purple sage blooms that smelled like the open range after rain. Once, in early July, it was a single stem of something she could not name, pale white with a faint blush of pink at the center, so delicate she was almost afraid to pick it up. She had begun to keep a small pottery jar on the kitchen table specifically for them, and she told herself it was simply because it would be wasteful to let them die on the porch. She paid attention now when she woke. She had even twice gotten up before dawn, and looked out the front window into the blue dark street. Both times she had seen nothing but the road and the faint shapes of buildings, and the stars fading above the ridge to the west. Whoever was leaving the flowers was careful. Whoever it was knew her schedule well enough to arrive and leave before she was awake, even when she tried to be awake earlier than usual. This was both impressive and faintly unnerving, and Susan spent some time deciding which of those feelings was more appropriate. The town of Harlan's Creek had a population of about 300 souls, depending on how you counted the ranches and homesteads in the surrounding land. It had a saloon, a general store, a church, a smithy, a small hotel that doubled as a boarding house, a doctor's office that the doctor rarely occupied because he was almost always out on calls, and a sheriff's office where Sheriff Dale Prout sat most afternoons reading the same 3-month-old newspaper with the concentration of a man who has nowhere else to be. Among the town's population was a man named Frank Keller, who worked as a ranch hand and occasional farrier out at the Bledsoe Ranch, which lay about 4 miles north of town. Frank was 35 years old, not tall but solidly built, with hands that showed years of hard work and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that would not have been called handsome in a parlor, but was very much the kind of face you wanted to see riding toward you across open country if you were in trouble. He had brown eyes and dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, and he wore the same battered brown hat every day of his life regardless of the weather. Frank Keller did not talk much. This was not shyness exactly, though it had sometimes been mistaken for that. He simply saw no particular reason to fill silence with words when silence was perfectly adequate. The men at the Bledsoe Ranch respected him the way cowhands respect a man who knows what he is doing and does not make their work harder. The people in town knew him the way you know a man who appears regularly at the same places, but never makes himself the center of anything. He bought his supplies, had his horse shod when needed, drank a beer at the saloon on Friday evenings without ever getting drunk or rowdy, and attended church perhaps once a month, sitting in the back and leaving before anyone could corner him into conversation. He had noticed Susan Sullivan the previous winter at Thomas Sullivan's funeral. He had not known Thomas well, just well enough to nod to in passing, but he had attended because most of the town attended, and because it felt like the right thing to do. He had stood at the back of the frozen churchyard in his good coat, the one he wore perhaps 4 times a year, and he had watched Susan Sullivan stand beside that crooked oak tree with her shoulders straight and her chin level, and her eyes clear even though everyone could see what it cost her to keep them that way. And something in Frank Keller had shifted on its foundation like a heavy thing that has been leaning against a wall for a long time and finally moves. He had not spoken to her at the funeral. He had not spoken to her for months afterward, though he saw her occasionally in town and always found some reason to be looking in another direction before she noticed him looking. He was a man who understood his own silences and knew how to wait, but he also understood, quietly and without drama, that he had no particular claim on Susan Sullivan's attention, and that a woman who had just lost her husband had enough to manage without a man she barely knew complicating things further. The flowers had been an impulse he still was not entirely sure he could explain. It was mid-June, and he had been riding the creek bed early in the morning checking on a section of fence the cattle had been pushing against, and he had come across a whole spread of those yellow wildflowers glowing in the early light like something someone had dropped by accident. He had stopped his horse and sat looking at them for a moment, and then he had thought about Susan Sullivan, and the thought and the flowers had been in his head at the same moment, and he had picked one without quite deciding to. He had ridden past her house on the way back because it was only a slight detour and the street was empty at that hour, and he had left the flower on her porch without dismounting, just leaned down and placed it there quickly and ridden on, and then spent the rest of that day feeling like an absolute fool. He was a 35-year-old working cowhand, not some boy writing poetry. He had shaken his head at himself more than once while he hammered fence posts that afternoon. But the next morning the impulse had returned, stronger, and the morning after that. And before he had fully reasoned with himself about whether this was sensible behavior, it had become a habit that felt as necessary as saddling his horse. He had no plan. He was not sure what he intended beyond leaving the flowers. He told himself it was simply a kind thing, that she was alone and grief was hard, and small beautiful things could make grief marginally less hard, and that he was not doing it for any reason that required examination. He was fairly certain he was lying to himself, but he was also fairly certain that stopping would feel like something important going dark, so he kept going. The specific problem that began to develop in late July was that people started to notice. It was Roy Baines who first mentioned it to Frank, with the cheerful bluntness of a man who has had a few beers and considers himself a good friend. Roy was a cowhand at the Bledsoe Ranch as well, 10 years younger than Frank, and with the kind of easy sociability that Frank had always regarded with a mixture of genuine affection and mild exhaustion. "You hear the talk in town," Roy said one evening, both of them sitting on the bunkhouse steps in the cooling air of a July twilight. "I generally do not seek out the talk in town," Frank said. "Somebody's been leaving flowers every morning on the Sullivan widow's porch. Every single morning, nobody knows who." Roy paused to let the drama of this settle. "Women in town are about half in love with the idea of it. Mrs. Dearborn at the store has a list of suspects she's been working through. The Lester boy, that new fellow from the telegraph office, old Harmon Geist," Roy snorted, "like Harmon Geist could get up before dawn without setting a barn on fire." Frank said nothing. "You got any idea who it might be?" Roy asked, looking at him sideways. "No," Frank said, which was technically accurate in the sense that he had no idea what he was doing or why, so calling it an idea seemed generous. Roy looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic. Then he let it go, which was one of the things Frank genuinely liked about Roy. But it got more complicated in August when Susan Sullivan began asking questions in a more systematic way. She approached it the way she approached most things, with quiet, determined practicality. She started paying attention to tracks on the road in front of her house. She asked the boy who delivered milk every morning, young Pete Alden, whether he ever passed anyone on his route before sunrise. She mentioned it at the church social, more directly this time, saying flat out that she would like to know who was doing it so she could thank them properly. This last part did something unexpected to Frank's chest when Roy reported it back to him, because Roy had apparently been at the church social with his girl and had heard the whole thing. Susan Sullivan wanted to say thank you. She had said it with her chin level and her voice steady, and apparently with a slight flush of color in her cheeks that several of the women present had noted and were currently discussing at length. Frank Keller sat with this information the way he sat with most important things, quietly, for a long time. The flowers continued. It was the last week of August, a Tuesday, when Susan Sullivan finally saw him. She had moved her rocking chair to the far side of the porch the night before, up against the wall where the shadows were deep even in early morning, and she had gotten up before the sky was anything more than a dark gray suggestion of the day to come, wrapped herself in a shawl despite the summer heat, and sat in the dark and waited with the patience of a woman who has had 8 months of practice at enduring discomfort. She heard the horse before she saw it. The quiet sound of hooves in soft dust, slow and unhurried. The sound of a man who is not trying to be sneaky because he has no reason to believe anyone is watching. Then she saw the shape of the horse and rider in the gray pre-dawn light, coming down the road at an easy walk. The rider leaned down from the saddle with the practiced ease of a man who has done this many times, and she saw the pale shapes of flowers against the dark porch boards, and then the rider straightened and began to turn his horse away. "Wait," Susan said. The word came out before she had decided to say it, quiet but clear in the still morning air. The horse stopped. The rider went very still. Susan stood up from the rocking chair, her shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the edge of the porch. She could see the man's silhouette now, the particular shape of a battered hat against the lightening sky, the set of broad shoulders, the way he sat a horse with the absolute ease of someone who had been doing it since he was a small boy. "Frank Keller," she said, because she could see him well enough now in the gathering dawn light to know him. She had seen him in town 100 times. She knew his hat and the way he sat and the particular stillness of him. She had simply never had cause to look closely until this moment. He took his hat off. She had never seen him do that on horseback before, and the gesture was so unexpectedly formal and so genuinely uncertain that something complicated moved through her chest. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said. His voice was low and even, and she could hear clearly that he was embarrassed, which was not something she had ever thought to associate with Frank Keller, who she had always assumed was simply beyond the reach of most ordinary human discomfort. "How long?" she asked. He considered this. 10 weeks, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her and did not look away, which she appreciated because a man who cannot hold your gaze in an awkward moment is a man who cannot be trusted to hold anything else. "Why?" she asked. Another pause. The sky was turning from gray to the pale yellow pink of early morning, and she could see him more clearly now, could see the way his jaw worked slightly as he searched for an answer that was honest without being more than she wanted to hear. "Because I thought you might find them pleasant," he said finally. Then, after a beat, "and because I find them easier than words." Susan Sullivan stood on her porch with her shawl around her shoulders and looked at Frank Keller on his horse in the pink morning light, and felt something she had not felt in almost a year, which was the distinct and complicated sense that she was being regarded, not pitied, not managed, not handled carefully the way people handle the recently bereaved, but actually seen by someone who had no particular obligation to see her, and had done it anyway every morning for 10 weeks. And left flowers rather than words because he understood something about the difference between the two. "Will you come in for coffee?" she said. It was not what she had planned to say. She was not sure she had planned to say anything beyond identifying him and thanking him and sending him on his way so she could think about it in private. But the words came out sounding reasonable, and she stood by them. Frank Keller put his hat back on, swung down from his horse, tied the reins to the porch post, and followed her inside, ducking slightly under the low doorframe the way tall people do, and the way Frank did not need to but did anyway, out of some habit of caution. And Susan found herself noticing this detail and tucking it away somewhere she would take it out and look at later. Her kitchen was small and clean and smelled of yesterday's bread. The pottery jar on the table held the flowers from the previous morning, still bright. Frank sat in one of the 2 chairs at the table and placed his hat on his knee, and Susan put the coffee on and did not look at him more than was necessary while she got the cups down from the shelf. "You should know," she said, her back to him, measuring the coffee, "that I have been trying to find you for nearly a month." "I know," he said. "Roy told me you asked at the church social, and you still came every morning." "Yes." She turned to look at him then. He met her eyes steadily. "That is either very brave or very stubborn," she said. Something crossed his face that might, on a more expressive man, have been a smile. "I have been told they can look the same," he said. The coffee heated and she poured it and sat across from him and they talked. It was not easy conversation, not at first. Frank Keller was not a man who talked easily, and Susan Sullivan was not a woman who trusted easily. And the two of them sat in her small kitchen in the growing morning light with their coffee cups in their hands, and had one of those conversations that consists as much of silence as of words, but in which the silence is doing a great deal of important work. He told her he worked at the Bledsoe Ranch. She said she knew. He said he had been at the ranch for 4 years, having come down from Colorado where he had worked cattle since he was 16. She asked what had brought him south, and he said it was a combination of bad winters and a desire to see different country, the way a man sometimes just needs to move on and the direction does not matter as much as the moving. She understood this. She said so. She told him she had grown up in Missouri, that she and Thomas had come to Texas in 1873, when they were newly married and full of the particular optimism that newly married people have about open land and hard work. Frank nodded. He said the panhandle had a way of testing that kind of optimism, but that it also rewarded the people who held on to it, which was the kind of thing a person says when they mean something true but do not want to make it sound sentimental. She asked him about the first flower, whether it had been intentional or accidental, and he was honest about the impulse at the creek bed and about feeling like a fool afterward, and this honesty made her relax by a measurable degree, because a man who will admit to feeling like a fool is a man who is not performing. He drank his coffee and she refilled it without asking, and somewhere in the second cup the conversation became easier. They talked about the summer heat and whether the range was getting drier and what that meant for the ranches and whether the creek would hold through September. They talked about the church social and whether Alma Dearborn's pie was actually as good as everyone claimed or whether people were simply afraid to say otherwise. And Frank said, with complete gravity, that he had never eaten Mrs. Dearborn's pie because he avoided social gatherings where food was offered to him by women with fixed smiles who wanted something in return. And Susan laughed, unexpectedly, a real laugh that surprised her more than it surprised him, and the sound of it in her kitchen felt like a window being opened in a room that had been shut for too long. He left before 8 in the morning, because he had work and she had work, and they were both people who did what needed to be done. He took his hat from his knee and put it on and thanked her for the coffee with a straightforwardness that contained no awkwardness and no performance, and she stood in the doorway and watched him untie his horse and swing up into the saddle. "Frank," she said. He looked back at her. "The flowers," she said. "I did find them pleasant. I want you to know that." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he touched the brim of his hat and rode off down the road in the early morning light. And Susan Sullivan stood in her doorway and watched him go, and felt the morning settle around her in a way that was different from how it had felt the morning before. She spent the next 3 days thinking about him with the focused attention of a woman who is trying to decide whether something is real or whether she is simply lonely enough to make it feel real. She held herself to a stern accounting, the way she did with the household money, not allowing sentiment to obscure fact. The fact was that she had spoken to Frank Keller exactly once, for perhaps an hour, over coffee in her kitchen. The fact was that she did not truly know him. The fact was that she was a widow of 8 months, and that the grief, while no longer acute, was still very present, and that any feeling she had now needed to be examined carefully before she trusted it. But she also knew what she had felt when he laughed at something she said, quietly, almost privately, as though laughter were something he did not share with just anyone. She knew what she had felt when he was honest about feeling like a fool at the creek. She knew what she had felt when he left every morning for 10 weeks without leaving a name, and that was the piece of it she kept returning to, because it spoke of something she recognized, a kind of caring that did not demand acknowledgement, that did not keep a ledger of what it was owed. Thomas had been a good man, but he had kept a ledger. Not cruelly, not even consciously, but he had a way of remembering what he had done and cataloging it somewhere in himself where she could sometimes feel it sitting. It was not the worst thing in a marriage, but it was not nothing either. The flowers had no ledger. She was still thinking about this on Thursday morning when she opened her door and found, as she had not quite expected but had half hoped, another bunch of yellow wildflowers on her porch. She picked them up and stood in the doorway and looked down the road and saw nothing, as she had seen nothing every morning before that Tuesday when she had finally positioned herself to see. But this time, the nothing felt different. This time it contained a person she knew, a brown hat and steady eyes and a voice that found words with care, the way a man picks his way across uncertain ground, not timid, just attentive. She went to the general store that morning and asked Alma Dearborn, as casually as she could manage, what she knew about Frank Keller. Alma Dearborn did not become the primary source of information in Harlan's Creek by missing opportunities, and her eyes sharpened immediately with the precision of a woman who has spotted something worth tracking. "Frank Keller from the Bledsoe Ranch," Alma said. "That is the one," Susan said, examining a bolt of fabric with what she hoped was convincing indifference. "Quiet man," Alma said. "Keeps to himself. Has a reputation for being the most reliable hand Bledsoe has, which is saying something because Bledsoe is a hard man to satisfy. Not married, never been married as far as anyone knows. Came from Colorado or maybe Wyoming, accounts differ. Hasn't any family in the area." A pause. "Susan Sullivan, are you asking me about Frank Keller for a reason that I am going to be very pleased about?" "I am asking because I like to know my neighbors," Susan said, buying the fabric she did not need and leaving with her chin in the air. But the information settled in her the way good information does, adding to rather than complicating what she already knew, and she felt something in herself that she decided, with characteristic precision, to call interest. Just interest. She was interested in Frank Keller. This was allowed. This was reasonable. This did not mean anything beyond itself until she decided it did. Frank, for his part, had spent the same 3 days in a state of mental activity unusual for him. He was not, by nature, an agonizer. He made decisions based on what he knew and what he felt, and he did not second-guess them excessively. But the morning in Susan Sullivan's kitchen had done something to him that he was finding difficult to categorize. He had drunk coffee in that small, clean kitchen, with the pottery jar of flowers on the table, and the morning light coming through the window, and talked with her for an hour and come away feeling like he had been somewhere he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. He had known, in an abstract way, that he was leaving the flowers because of something he felt for her. But feeling something in abstract and sitting in a woman's kitchen drinking her coffee while she makes you laugh without even trying are two different things, and the second had made the first very concrete indeed. The problem, as Frank identified it with his usual economy of analysis, was twofold. One, he was a ranch hand with modest wages and a bedroll in the Bledsoe bunkhouse, and Susan Sullivan owned her house and managed her affairs with a competence that made it clear she did not need to be rescued by anyone. Two, she was a widow of 8 months, and whatever he felt, she was still in the middle of something large and difficult, and he had no intention of rushing her through it for his own convenience. What he decided in the end was the same thing he had been doing all along, to show up quietly without demands, and let her set the pace of whatever this was going to be or not be. The flowers continued. On the second Friday after their coffee morning, Susan Sullivan walked out to the Bledsoe Ranch. She told herself she was going because she needed to speak to Clarence Bledsoe about possibly purchasing one of his horses, which was true. She had been considering it. Her own aging mare was getting slow, and she had the money set aside. She did not tell herself she was going because she knew Frank Keller worked there, and that there was a reasonable chance she might see him. But she had tied her hair up more carefully than usual and put on her better dress, which she acknowledged privately told its own story. Clarence Bledsoe was a gruff man in his 50s who had built his ranch through a combination of genuine hard work and a talent for identifying good land before anyone else did. He sold her a gray mare for a fair price after very little negotiation, which she took as a sign that he respected her, and they shook hands on it the way two people do when both of them mean business. Frank was at the paddock fence when she came out to look at the horses. He had clearly been working, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a rope in his hands, and he stopped when he saw her with the expression of a man who has been ambushed by something good. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "Mr. Keller," she said. Then, because she had decided on the walk over that if she was going to be honest with herself, she might as well be honest out loud. "I believe you know why I am really here." He looked at the rope in his hands. "I have a thought or two about it," he said. "Would you like to walk with me back to town?" she asked. "It is a pleasant enough afternoon." He put the rope down, rolled his sleeves down with the careful efficiency of a man who takes small tasks seriously, and told Roy, who was watching from near the barn with the enormous interest of a man observing history and progress, that he was going into town. Roy said something Frank chose not to hear. They walked the 4 miles back to Harlan's Creek in the late afternoon sun, and this time the conversation came more easily. They talked about the horse she had bought, and the best route to take when riding out toward the creek, and whether the trail that cut through the Jensen property was still passable after the summer rains. They talked about the ranch and the cattle and a young horse Frank had been working with that had a bad habit of shying at shadows. And Susan said she had once known a mule with the same problem, and that patience was the only cure. And Frank said patience was generally the only cure for most problems. And she looked at him sideways when he said it, and he met her look without flinching. By the time they reached the edge of town, they had covered a good deal of ground that had nothing to do with horses or cattle. By the time they reached the front of her house, the sun was low and the evening sky was going gold and pink, and they stood in the road in that light, and it occurred to Susan that she had not thought about grief once in the last 2 hours, and that this was not nothing. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. "Thank you for asking me," he said. She looked at him directly. "I would like to ask you again," she said, "perhaps on Sunday if you are not occupied." "I am not occupied on Sunday," Frank said. "Good," she said, and went inside and stood with her back against the closed door for a moment in the warm dark of her hallway and let herself feel, fully and without apology, that she was glad. They walked on Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. It became a thing the town noted and discussed with the energy that small towns invest in the romantic lives of their inhabitants, and Susan heard the discussions and did not mind them, mostly, and Frank was aware of them and minded them even less. September came and the heat began to ease, and the light changed to that particular gold of early autumn on the Texas panhandle, and the walks began to involve stopping, sometimes by the creek where the cottonwoods were starting to turn, sometimes on the rise south of town where you could see the whole valley spread out below, and the Bledsoe ranch in the distance, and her own house small and neat at the edge of the road. And sometimes just in the road itself, when they had been talking about something important enough to stop walking for. He told her about Colorado on one of those stopped walks, about growing up in a small settlement north of Denver where his father had run cattle, and his mother had run everything else, and his 2 brothers had done the hard work of being older brothers, which Frank described without bitterness, but with a candor that told her it had not been easy. His father had died when he was 22, and the ranch had gone to the elder brothers, not because anyone was unkind, but because that was simply how things were done. And Frank had found himself at 22 with skills and no land, and had decided that west and south was as good a direction as any. She told him about Missouri and about meeting Thomas at a church dance when she was 23 and he was 25, about the early years of the marriage when everything had been difficult in the way. New things are difficult but also lit from inside with the particular excitement of building something together. She told him about coming to Texas and about the years of drought in 1874 and 1875 that had nearly broken them, and about how they had come back from that together, and about the grief that had come and gone in waves since November, enormous and then smaller and then enormous again without warning, like weather. Frank listened with the quality of attention that people almost never give anymore, the kind that makes the person talking feel that every word is landing somewhere and being kept. He did not offer solutions or reassurances or silver linings. He simply listened, and occasionally said something brief and true, and this was so different from what she usually received, the careful comfort of people who wanted her to be done grieving because grief made them uncomfortable, that she sometimes had to stop and let the difference settle in her. On a Sunday in early October, they stopped by the creek and the cottonwood leaves were bright yellow around them, and the water was running clear and low, and she was telling him something about Thomas, and she stopped mid-sentence because she had realized that she was telling him about Thomas not because she needed to talk about Thomas, but because she trusted Frank enough to share every part of her life, including the parts that were sad, and that this trust had arrived quietly, the way his flowers had arrived. Every morning until they were simply part of the day. "Frank," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the water for a moment. "I want to be honest with you," she said, "because I think you are a person who deserves honesty and not management." "All right," he said very quietly. "I am still grieving," she said. "I do not think that will stop for some time yet, and I am not sure what to do with what I feel when I am with you because it is not something I expected to feel and the timing of it is strange even by my own accounting." He said nothing, waiting. "But I know that it is real," she said, turning to look at him. "And I know that you are a good man. And I know that I would very much prefer to continue these walks indefinitely." A pause. "What I am saying is that I am not asking for more than you have given. I am saying I want to keep what we have and see where it goes, if you are willing." Frank Keller looked at her in the October light with the yellow leaves coming down around them and said, "Susan, I have been willing since June," and said it so simply and directly that she felt it go all the way through her, clean and warm like the first good thing in a long time. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm, and he put his hand over hers for just a moment. And it was not a grand gesture, but it was completely genuine, and genuine was what she had been needing. October moved toward November, and the anniversary of Thomas's death approached, and Susan felt it coming the way you feel weather on a change of wind. She told Frank about it honestly, explaining that she expected it to be hard and that she might need some quiet around that time, and he said he understood and that he would be there or not be there, whichever she needed, and she should just tell him. He came to the house on the actual anniversary day, not to come in, but he left flowers on her porch as he always did, and something about the fact that the ritual continued unchanged on that of all days, that he did not skip it because it was complicated or treat it as an interruption to the ordinary, moved her profoundly. She sat with the flowers on her lap on the porch that morning, and cried properly for the first time in months, the quiet, thorough crying of someone releasing something that had been stored too long, and when it was done, she felt lighter in a way she had not felt in a year. She went to Thomas's grave that afternoon and stood by the crooked oak and told him about Frank, which felt necessary even if it felt strange, and she said that she was going to be all right, which she believed for the first time. In November, Frank asked her to the church Christmas social, which was still 6 weeks away, and the fact that he was making plans 6 weeks in advance told her something about how seriously he was taking this. She said yes. He held his hat and said good and left, and she stood in her doorway smiling at his back as he walked away down the road. The Christmas social was held in the church hall, and it was crowded and warm and smelled of pine and beeswax candles, and Mrs. Dearborn's suspiciously good pie. Susan wore a dress of dark green wool that she had made herself, having an actual talent for sewing that the town had recognized and occasionally commissioned, and she pinned her dark hair up with the good combs that had been her mother's. Frank arrived at her door in his good coat, the one he wore 4 times a year, and she noted that he had made an effort, that his hat was his best hat and his boots were clean, and his face was freshly shaved, and he was holding a small bunch of wildflowers that were not wildflowers, because it was December, but were instead a small collection of sprigs of cedar and dried flowers from who knows where, tied with the same rough twine she had come to recognize. She took them from him and found a place for them in the pottery jar on the table before they left, and he watched her do it without saying anything, but she was aware of his watching and felt it as the warm thing it was. At the social, they were recognized by everyone as an item, which Harlan's Creek had been anticipating for months, and greeted with the satisfaction of a community whose best guess has been confirmed. Alma Dearborn smiled at Susan across the room with the particular expression of a woman who has been right about something all along. Roy, who was there with his girl Clara, raised his beer in Frank's direction with enormous satisfaction, and Frank acknowledged this with a nod so slight it was almost invisible, but Roy saw it and looked pleased. They danced. Frank was not a natural dancer, and she was not much better, but they were willing and the fiddler was good, and the floor was crowded enough that no one's particular shortcomings were obvious. And there is something about dancing with a person in a warm room with music and light around you that removes all pretense very quickly. He held her with a carefulness that was also a kind of confidence, the way he did everything, not tentative but deliberate, and she followed him with an ease that surprised her. At some point in the evening, during a pause between songs, they found themselves standing together at the edge of the room, and he leaned slightly close to say something to her about the pie, something dry and fond, and she turned to respond and found his face very near hers in the warm candlelight, and they both stopped talking for a moment. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, quietly enough that it was just between them. "If you will allow it." She looked at him. "Properly," she said. "With the intention of making it permanent," he said. "When you are ready, I am not in a hurry. I want you to know where I stand is all." She held his gaze for a long moment in the candlelight and felt the truth of it, that he was not in a hurry, that he had never been in a hurry, that 10 weeks of flowers before she even knew who was leaving them was proof enough of a patience that was not passivity but something deeper, a willingness to let things grow at the speed they needed to grow. "You may call on me properly," she said. "And Frank, you should know that I am not as far from ready as you might think." He smiled then, a full smile that she had never quite seen before, and that changed his face entirely. And she thought, with a clarity that had no ambiguity in it at all, that she was in love with this man. The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was a cold one in the Texas panhandle, colder than the previous year, with ice on the water troughs before sunrise and a wind off the north that could find every gap in a house's walls and exploit it. Susan learned that the gap above the kitchen window needed new caulking, and she was on a stool attempting this repair on a Saturday morning in January when Frank appeared at her door, saw what she was doing, took the putty knife from her hand with a gentleness that did not suggest she was incapable but simply that he was taller and the stool was unstable, and finished the job while she made coffee. She watched him work with the appreciation of someone who knows good work when they see it. He was economical and precise, and did not make a production of the task, just did it, and the ease of having another person in the house who simply did things without needing to be thanked for every gesture was something she had almost forgotten was possible. He began stopping by on Saturdays in addition to their Sunday walks. He repaired the loose step on her porch without being asked, having noticed it one morning when he left the flowers and apparently filing it in the category of things to be dealt with. He was there when the cold pipe in the back of the house froze and cracked, and she was faced with a genuine emergency, and he dealt with it with a competence that she would have found annoying if she had not been so relieved. She cooked for him in return, and he ate with the appreciation of a man who has been eating bunkhouse food for 4 years and considers a properly cooked meal something approaching a miracle. In February, Clarence Bledsoe told Frank that he was thinking of selling a small parcel of land on the eastern edge of the ranch property. Nothing large, 40 acres with a creek running through it, and a set of corrals in reasonable condition. He was offering it to Frank first, given his years of service, before putting it to general sale. The price was fair. Frank spent a week thinking about it. He told Susan about it on a cold Sunday walk, not asking for her opinion exactly but sharing it in the way you share things with a person whose opinion has become necessary to your thinking. She asked careful questions about the land and the price and what his plans were for it, and he said he had been thinking about a small horse-training operation, that he had a talent for working with difficult horses, and there was a market for it among the ranches in the area who were always dealing with animals that needed skilled handling. She asked whether he could afford the land on his current savings. He said he had been saving for a long time, that he lived simply and spent little, and that he could afford the land and have enough left to build a modest house on it and get the operation started. She looked at the creek and the bare cottonwoods and said it sounded like a solid plan. What neither of them said, but both of them understood, was that the plan was also about having a place of his own, a real place, a foundation, before he asked her to be part of his life permanently. She was not a woman who needed a man to have land before she could consider him, but she was a woman who understood that Frank Keller needed to have it for himself before he could offer anything to anyone else, and this understanding of him, the way his pride worked and where it came from, was part of what she loved. He bought the land in March. On the first day of April 1879, Frank Keller arrived at Susan Sullivan's house on a Sunday afternoon with his hat in his hands, and a directness in his expression that told her this was not a visit for coffee or a walk. She was in the garden when he came through the gate, tying back the new growth of the kitchen plants that had survived the winter, and she stood up and looked at him and waited. "I have been calling on you properly since December," he said. "You have," she said. "And before that I spent 4 months leaving flowers on your porch without the courage to tell you my name," he said. "You did," she said, her voice soft. "I would like to ask you to marry me, Susan," he said. "I have land and I have plans and I have the intention to build something good on both of them. But more than any of that, I want to build it with you, specifically. Not because you need someone to take care of you, because you clearly do not, but because everything I am thinking about and planning for and hoping for has you in it, and it would be honest to say so." She had known this was coming. She had known it the way you know weather, but hearing it said plainly in his careful, honest way still reached something in her that she had kept very carefully protected for a very long time. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes," she said again. "Frank, the answer is yes. The answer has been yes since October. I was simply waiting for you to ask." He laughed, the good laugh she loved, and she crossed the garden in 3 steps, and he caught her hands in his and held them, and they stood in her garden in the April sun and looked at each other with the particular look of people who have arrived somewhere after a long road and find it is exactly where they wanted to be. He kissed her there in the garden, the first kiss, careful at first and then not careful at all, and she kissed him back with the conviction of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and is not afraid of it. They were married in June 1879, exactly 1 year after the first flower had appeared on Susan's porch. The wedding was small, held at the church with Reverend Michaels presiding, and the town of Harlan's Creek attended in numbers that suggested they had all been waiting for this particular event and were not about to miss it. Alma Dearborn made a cake and cried about it in a way that managed to be both touching and slightly theatrical. Roy stood up with Frank and spent the entire ceremony trying to look dignified, which he mostly achieved. Susan wore a dress of cream-colored muslin that she had made herself, with small embroidered flowers at the hem and collar, and she carried a bunch of wildflowers from the creek, because it was the only choice that made any sense. Frank had built a house on the 40 acres by June, not large but solidly made, with a proper kitchen and a south-facing window in the bedroom that let in the morning light, and a porch that faced the creek and the cottonwood trees. He had done most of the building himself with help from Roy and a couple of the other Bledsoe hands who showed up on weekends, because that was what men in that country did for each other. The corrals were up, and he had 3 horses already contracted for training when they moved in after the wedding. Susan brought her pottery jar and her rocking chair and the good combs that had been her mother's and the sensibility that had kept her going through 8 months of grief, and she also brought the energy of a woman who is not merely surviving something but is actually looking forward, and the house expanded to hold all of it. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that sets the tone for everything after. They were not perfect. Frank's silences, which she had found so compelling from a distance, occasionally felt exclusionary up close, and she had to learn that when he went quiet it was not about her, and he had to learn that she needed him to say so directly rather than assuming she knew. She had habits of self-sufficiency that were sometimes indistinguishable from stubbornness, and had to be reminded that letting someone help was not the same as surrendering something. They had conversations that were difficult and some that were arguments, and some that started as arguments and became conversations halfway through, and the quality of their honesty with each other, that particular quality they had established in her kitchen over coffee on an early morning in August, held through all of it, and made the difficult things manageable. Frank's horse-training operation grew steadily through that first year. He had a reputation that preceded him, and word spread among the ranches in a 30-mile radius that Frank Keller could do things with a difficult horse that other men could not. And this was true, not because of anything mystical, but because he had the patience to understand what an animal was afraid of before trying to fix it, the same patience that had produced 10 weeks of flowers. By the end of 1879, he had more work than he could handle comfortably, and had begun thinking about hiring on a boy to help. Susan expanded her kitchen garden into something that could supply not just their table but a modest amount for sale. She sold vegetables to the general store and eggs in quantity and occasionally bread when she had the time and inclination, and she was making enough to consider it a real contribution to their household, which she required of herself as a matter of personal principle. In the winter of 1879, Susan realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before telling Frank, not because she was afraid to, but because she wanted to be certain, and because she wanted to have some time with it alone first, the way you turn a jewel in the light before showing it to anyone else. When she told him, they were at the kitchen table after supper, and the lamp was lit, and the cold was pressing against the windows, and she said simply that she was expecting a child and watched his face. Frank Keller, who had sat in her kitchen in August of 1878 with his hat on his knee looking embarrassed and uncertain, who had declared his intentions at a church Christmas social with a straightforwardness that had made her love him on the spot, who had kissed her in a kitchen garden, and built a house with his own hands, and gentled difficult horses for years with the patience of someone who understood that trust cannot be forced, sat across from her in the lamplight with his coffee cooling beside him, and did the most unexpected thing she had ever seen him do. His eyes filled. He did not cry exactly in the way the word is usually meant, but his eyes were full and bright, and he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his and said her name, just her name, Susan, in a voice that had everything in it that he was, and she felt it travel from her hand all the way through her. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see that he was. "I am more than happy," he said. "I don't have a word for what I am." She squeezed his hand. "Happy will serve," she said. The baby was born in late August of 1880, and he was a boy, solid and loud and frankly irritated about having arrived, which Frank said showed good character, and Susan said showed he was going to be exhausting. They named him James Thomas Keller, the James for Frank's father and the Thomas for Susan's husband, because she felt it was right to carry that name forward, and Frank agreed immediately without hesitation, which told her again everything she needed to know about who he was. James was the kind of baby who had opinions from the beginning. He was healthy and grew fast, and had Frank's brown eyes and Susan's dark hair, and the combined stubbornness of both parents, concentrated into a small person who had not yet learned that stubbornness required any social justification. Frank held him with the confidence of someone surprising themselves, the natural ease of a man who handles large animals for a living and therefore does not drop things, and the tenderness of a man who did not know until this moment that he had this particular capacity. Roy came to see the baby with Clara, who he had married in December 1879, and who was 4 months pregnant herself, and Roy held James with the expression of a man practicing, and Clara and Susan sat together and talked about the parts of pregnancy and childbirth that are not mentioned in polite company, and laughed in the way of women who have gone through something significant together, even if they went through it slightly apart. Life on the 40 acres settled into a shape. The horse training operation was successful enough by 1881 that Frank brought on a boy named Charlie, who was 17 and genuinely good with horses and eager to learn. And Frank taught him with the same patience he applied to the horses themselves, which meant Charlie stayed and got better, and eventually became an actual asset rather than just an extra set of hands. The house had been expanded by Frank over the winter of 1880, a proper sitting room added and the kitchen made larger, because Susan needed a larger kitchen and said so. And what Susan needed, Frank provided where he was able and said so when he was not. Susan had, by 1881, built a small reputation for herself as a seamstress of genuine skill, a craft she had always had but had not turned to income previously. The women of Harlan's Creek had noted the embroidery on her wedding dress and the precision of her work, and requests had come in, wedding dresses and Sunday dresses, and the particular specialty of children's clothing that was small enough to require precision. She had set up a corner of the sitting room with her sewing things, and worked there in the mornings when James was with Frank in the corrals, which James was whenever Frank would allow it, which was most of the time because he seemed to understand that his son needed to be where he was. James, at 2 years old, had adopted the same relationship with horses that Frank had, which was the kind of perfect calm trust that the horses responded to immediately. And Frank watched his son among the animals with an expression that Susan had never seen on a human face before, and could only describe as something like joy, so complete it had no performance in it at all. In 1882 she was pregnant again, and this time it was a girl, born in April and named Catherine Rose, after Susan's mother whose name had been Catherine. Catherine was quieter than James had been, observant in the way that quiet babies sometimes are, watching the world with enormous dark eyes from very early on as though she was compiling information. She had Frank's patience and Susan's precision, and from the very beginning had the quality of someone who is very carefully deciding things. Frank sat in the rocking chair that had come from Susan's house at the edge of town, and held Catherine on the first evening of her life while James slept in the next room and Susan rested, and he talked quietly to the baby the way he had talked to difficult horses, low and steady and honest, and Susan, who was not quite asleep, heard him and kept her eyes closed and let the sound of him fill the house. By 1883, the town of Harlan's Creek had grown considerably. The railroad had come within 20 miles, which had changed everything, bringing commerce and people and all the complications of a frontier town moving towards something more established. New families arrived with regularity. A second general store opened, which Alma Dearborn took as a personal affront and responded to by simply being better, which she managed. A proper school was established, the first in the area, in a building that the community had raised together the previous fall, and Susan was involved in the effort from the beginning, not in a grand way but in the way she did everything, practically and without requiring recognition, helping organize the materials and the labor and writing letters to the county about teacher placement with the careful directness that she brought to everything she wanted done. Frank contributed the lumber, milled from a stand of trees on the northern edge of his property that he had been intending to clear anyway, and he spent 3 Saturdays building with the other men of the town, and Susan watched him work with Roy and Clarence Bledsoe and half a dozen others, and felt something large and simple, which was gratitude. For this life that had arrived through 10 weeks of wildflowers and an early morning in August, and a man who had been brave enough to stay on his horse until she told him to wait. James started school in 1884 when he was 4 years old, technically slightly young, but the teacher, a woman named Miss Grace Pullman who had come from Ohio and had strong views about early education, took one look at James and his enormous dark eyes and his opinions about everything, and said he was ready. He was. He came home from the first day with the expression of a person who has discovered that the world is larger than they thought and is enthusiastically in favor of this development. Catherine was 2 and did not yet have an opinion about school, but had very definite opinions about most other things, including where she sat at meals, which was always beside Frank, and which hat Frank wore on any given day, which she evaluated and occasionally rejected by removing it and placing a different one on his head with a seriousness that made it impossible not to laugh. Frank had, by 1884, acquired a small but genuine reputation in the county for his horsework that went beyond the local ranches. He had handled several horses that other men had given up on, and one particular case, a gray stallion belonging to a rancher in the next county who was prepared to have the animal shot, had been resolved so successfully that the story had spread and resulted in Frank being sought out from considerable distances. He handled this with characteristic quiet, taking only the work he could do well and turning away what he could not, and the operation remained small enough to be excellent. Susan had been thinking, since the fall of 1883, about something she had not yet said aloud to Frank, which was that she wanted to start a small school of her own, or rather to contribute to the one that existed in a more formal way. She had spoken to Miss Pullman and discovered that the school had more children than one teacher could adequately handle, and that Miss Pullman would welcome an assistant who had the education and the inclination. Susan had both. She had been well educated by her mother in Missouri, and had kept up with her reading through the years in Texas, with the persistence of someone who considers the life of the mind a practical necessity. She told Frank about it on a Sunday evening in October 1883, sitting on their porch with the creek sounds in the background and the smell of autumn in the air, and he listened with his full attention and then said, without any pause for weighing, that he thought it was an excellent idea and that the school would be better for it. "You are not concerned about the time?" she asked. "With James and Catherine and the sewing and the garden?" He looked at her. "Susan," he said, "have I ever suggested to you that your time belongs to anything other than yourself?" She thought about it. He had not. Not once in all the time she had known him. "No," she said. "Then I am not starting now," he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his on the armrest, and he turned his hand over so their palms met. And they sat like that in the October evening, and it was so complete and quiet and real that she felt the whole of it at once. The flowers and the coffee and the garden and the walking and the wedding and James and Catherine and the school and the house and the corrals and all of it, laid out behind her and ahead of her like a landscape, you can see all at once from high ground. She began working at the school in January 1884, 3 mornings a week, teaching reading and letters to the younger children while Miss Pullman handled the older ones. She was, it turned out, a natural teacher, which surprised her even though it probably should not have, given that she had always been able to make complex things plain when she bothered to try. The children responded to her with the particular confidence that children have in adults who are genuinely interested in them, and James, who was in her class for exactly 1 week before Miss Pullman moved him to the older group because he was already outpacing his peers, told his father with great satisfaction that his mother was the best teacher in the school. Frank told Susan this, and she said James was biased, and Frank said he agreed, but that did not make James wrong. The spring of 1884 brought a complication that had been building for some time. A man named Denton Prout, no relation to the sheriff, had been acquiring land in the area through methods that the ranchers and homesteaders of the region found troubling. He had money from somewhere unspecified, and a way of showing up at moments of financial difficulty, with offers that were fair enough on the surface, but that tended to result in people finding themselves with less than they had started with and Denton Prout with considerably more. He approached Frank in April with an offer on the creek land, substantially more than Frank had paid for it, framed as a tremendous opportunity that Frank would be foolish to pass up. Frank listened to the offer completely and then said no, thank you. He was not interested in selling. Denton Prout was not accustomed to no. He came back with a higher offer, and then came back again with a third one, and on the third visit implied, in the careful way of a man who understands deniability, that it would be better for Frank to sell voluntarily than to find himself in circumstances where the land became unavailable to him through other means. Frank came home and told Susan about all 3 visits with his characteristic economy of detail, telling her what had been said and what had been implied without embellishment. She listened and felt a cold anger that had nothing theatrical about it. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Keep the land," he said. "Then we keep the land," she said. "What does he mean by other means?" Frank said he was not sure, but that Sheriff Prout, who was a decent and honest man whatever his lack of relation to Denton, should probably know about the visits. Susan agreed. Frank went to see the sheriff the next morning, and Dale Prout, who had his own concerns about Denton's operations, listened carefully and made notes and said he would be paying attention. What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic in the way of the stories people tell later, but it was significant. Several other landowners came forward with similar accounts of pressure from Denton Prout, and the sheriff's attention, combined with the combined refusal of the area's residents to be bought or intimidated, proved sufficient. Denton Prout left the county by summer, apparently finding the resistance more trouble than it was worth, and the land stayed where it was. Susan noticed during those weeks that the town had functioned as a community in the actual sense of the word, that people had stood together and that this standing together had been effective. She said as much to Frank, and he said he had known that about Harlan's Creek from early on, that it was the reason he had stayed when he could have moved on. "It is a good place," he said. "We have made it good," she said, meaning not just them but all of them. He considered this. "Both things can be true," he said. James was 5 and Catherine was 2 when the summer of 1884 brought a heat wave so severe that it parched everything that had survived the winter, and required the kind of constant effort and vigilance that turned summer into a season of endurance. The creek dropped to its lowest level in years, and Frank had to haul water in barrels for the corrals, and Susan's garden required twice the attention for half the result, and the whole region was stretched thin by the effort of it. In this context, and with the additional context of managing 2 children and 3 school mornings a week, and the sewing commissions that had continued to come in, Susan arrived at September of 1884 with the particular exhaustion of someone who has given a great deal for a long time without stopping. Frank saw it before she acknowledged it, in the way he saw most things, early and without commentary, and what he did was quietly take over several of the things that had been hers without discussion, simply doing them, the way he had left flowers without discussion. She found this and called him on it, because she could not afford to let things shift without naming them. "You are carrying extra," she said one evening. "You are carrying a great deal," he said. "I can manage," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I am not doing it because you cannot. I am doing it because we are married, and that means I carry when you are full." She sat with this. "I need you to say that when you do it," she said. "Not so I can refuse, so I know it is partnership and not management." "Fair," he said. "I will say it." "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," he said. And then, after a moment, "You are also full, and I am carrying, if that helps." She laughed in spite of herself. "It helps," she said. Autumn came, and the heat broke, and the creek rose again, and the land recovered, and Susan recovered, and everything found its balance. The way the panhandle always eventually found its balance, after testing how much you could take. Miss Grace Pullman left Harlan's Creek in October 1884, having received a letter from Ohio that involved a family situation she did not specify in detail, but which required her return. The school was left, briefly, without a head teacher, and the school board, which was a group of 5 men who met in the back of the general store and disagreed about everything except that the school was necessary, found themselves faced with a practical problem. They came to Susan. She was not their first thought. She knew that, because she was a woman and women were not generally considered for positions of institutional authority in 1884 in the Texas Panhandle, regardless of their competence. But she was their practical thought, because she was already there 3 mornings a week, and the children knew her, and she knew the curriculum, and there was no one else available who had remotely comparable qualifications. She negotiated with them for 3 days. She wanted to be paid the same rate Miss Pullman had received, and she wanted to set her own hours with some flexibility for her family, and she wanted to be given the formal title of schoolteacher rather than some lesser designation designed to manage the awkwardness of the situation. The school board agreed to all of it with less argument than she had expected, which she attributed to the absence of alternatives. She told Frank, and he looked at her across the kitchen table with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of pride, which was quieter than most people's pride but no less real. "Head teacher," he said. "Head teacher," she confirmed. "That school has no idea what it has acquired," he said. "It is beginning to," she said. She taught for the next 4 years with the conviction and thoroughness of someone who has found a second purpose. She was methodical and warm and demanded a great deal from the children, and the parents of Harlan's Creek, after a brief initial period of adjustment to having a woman in charge of their children's education, arrived at a consensus that the school was better than it had ever been. She hired an assistant in 1886, a young woman from Fort Worth named Eliza Marsh, who had some training and an eagerness to learn that Susan recognized and valued, and she taught Eliza the way Frank had taught Charlie, with patience and honest expectation, and Eliza became exactly the kind of colleague that made the whole operation stronger. James Keller, at school age, was identified early as the particular kind of student who is a challenge to teach because he goes faster than the lesson. Susan managed this by simply giving him harder material, which he consumed without slowing, and by setting him to help the younger children with things he had already mastered, which satisfied his need to be useful and taught him something that book learning could not, which was that knowing something and helping someone else know it are 2 different and equally valuable skills. Catherine at school age was different, methodical and thorough and precise, the child who always finished the work completely before moving to the next thing, and who could not be hurried without making errors that distressed her deeply. Susan knew this about her daughter and accommodated it, and Frank knew it and accommodated it too, and Catherine grew up knowing that her pace was respected, which is not a small thing for a child to know. In 1887, on a morning in May, Susan opened her front door and found flowers on the porch. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then turned around and looked at Frank, who was at the kitchen table with his coffee, watching her with the particular expression of a man who has done something he knows will land. "How?" she said. "I got up early," he said. She looked at the flowers, the familiar rough twine, the yellow wildflowers from the creek where there was still a good patch of them on the eastern bank. She picked them up and held them and felt 8 years collapse into a single moment, the empty road in the early dawn, the shape of a man on horseback leaning down, the pottery jar on the table, the coffee, all of it. "Frank Keller," she said. "Susan Keller," he said. She came back inside and put the flowers in the pottery jar and sat down across from him and picked up her own coffee. He was watching her with the brown eyes she had been looking into for 8 years and finding more in, always more in, the way some things never run out. "I thought I had stopped noticing them," she said. "When we moved here, when there was no porch to leave them on for a while, when things got busy." "Do you want me to stop?" he asked. "Do not dare," she said. He smiled the full smile that had changed his face entirely that night at the Christmas social in 1878, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it fit, as it always had, as she knew now it always would. She was 39 years old and he was 44, and James was 7 and Catherine was 5, and the horse operation was thriving, and the school was excellent, and the kitchen garden was productive, and the 40 acres along the creek were as beautiful in May as they had ever been. They had argued and made up and been honest when honesty was hard, and held each other through the rough seasons that came even in good lives. And she had sat many times on the porch that faced the creek and thought about the specific and unlikely road that had brought her to this particular morning, and it never failed to seem both improbable and completely inevitable, the way the best things often do. The summer of 1887 was a generous one, with rain at the right times and a breeze that made the heat manageable, and a particular quality of golden light in August that lay over the land like something given rather than earned. James spent most of that summer at Frank's side in the corrals, learning in the way that the best learning happens, by doing the real thing beside a person who is very good at it. He was 7 years old and already had a touch with horses that made Charlie, who was now 26 and Frank's full partner in the operation, shake his head and say the boy was going to be better than both of them before he was grown. Frank told Susan this, and she said the boy was certainly going to be more confident than both of them, and that this was either wonderful or exhausting and probably both. Catherine had decided by the end of that summer that she wanted to learn to read music. This was prompted by the acquisition of a small organ by the church, which the congregation had pooled funds for and which had arrived from San Antonio in June, and which Catherine had heard played at Sunday service and had immediately determined to play herself. Susan found a woman in the next town, 20 miles away, who gave lessons, and arranged for Catherine to go once a month with Frank, who had business in that direction anyway. Catherine took to it with the methodical thoroughness that she brought to everything, practicing with a patience that astonished even Frank, who was not easily astonished by patience. By the end of 1887, she could play 3 hymns without error, and by the spring of 1888, she was playing at Sunday services, sitting at the church organ with her feet barely reaching the pedals and her small, precise hands on the keys and her face concentrated and serious. And the congregation sat in the wooden pews and listened and felt something that was not just music. Frank always sat in the same pew when Catherine played, the third from the front on the right, which was not where he usually sat. He was a back-row man by habit and disposition, but when Catherine played, he moved forward and Susan sat beside him, and he watched their daughter, and his face was the face of a man who cannot contain what he feels and has stopped trying. In 1888, Roy and Clara Baines had their 3rd child, and Clara had a difficult time of it, and Susan spent 3 days at their house helping Clara and managing their 2 older children and making sure Roy did not dissolve entirely from anxiety, which he was inclined to do. The baby was born healthy and Clara recovered, and Roy, who had been Frank's first and oldest friend in Harlan's Creek, and who had watched the flowers and said nothing, and stood up at the wedding and held James as a baby, and told Frank approximately once a week that he was the luckiest man in the county, went 3 days later to Frank's place with a bottle of whiskey that he had been saving for a special occasion, and said that he thought the occasion had arrived. Frank agreed that it had. They sat on Frank's porch with the creek in front of them, and the evening coming down soft and warm, and drank the whiskey slowly and talked about the years, and the things that had happened in them, and eventually sat in a silence that had everything in it. And that was, both of them knew without saying, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have been through real things together. The school year of 1888 to 1889 was the largest yet, with 42 students and Susan and Eliza, and a 3rd teacher, a young man named Daniel Frost who had come from Austin with a credential in mathematics and a willingness to be told by Susan exactly how things were done, which he accepted with more grace than some might have. The school had outgrown its original building, and there was talk of an addition, and Susan was part of every conversation about it because she understood both the practical and the pedagogical dimensions in ways that the school board had learned not to question. She was 41 years old in 1888 and felt, in a way she had not expected and could not have imagined in November of 1877, when Thomas had been thrown from his horse and the ground had frozen, that her life was full. Not easy, it had never been easy, but full in the way that is the only real kind of good, where the difficulty and the joy are both real and neither cancels the other. Frank was 46 in 1888, and his dark hair was substantially gray now, which suited him in the way that time suits some faces, the lines and the gray settling into something that was not lesser but was more itself. He worked hard and rose early, and the operation had expanded in the previous year to include a breeding program for working ranch horses that Charlie largely managed, and which was doing well. He sat on the porch most evenings when the weather allowed and Susan sat beside him, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and both were fine. On their 10th wedding anniversary, in June of 1889, Frank left flowers on the porch. This was expected by this point, as it had become his custom on any day that mattered, and Susan was not surprised when she opened the door and found them. But this time there was something with them, a small paper folded and left under the stems. She picked it up and unfolded it and read it. He had written in his careful, slightly labored hand, the hand of a man who was better at most things than he was at writing but who understood when writing was necessary. Susan, 10 years, every morning, not because I have to, because I choose to. Every morning I choose to, the same as the first one. Frank. She stood on the porch in the June morning and held the paper and the flowers, and felt something that went far beyond what she had words for, and that she did not try to name because some things are better felt than named. She went inside and he was at the table with his coffee, waiting, and she sat down and did not say anything for a moment, and neither did he. Then she said, "Every morning." "Every morning," he said. She put her hand on the table, palm up, and he put his over it, and they stayed like that in the June light with the sound of the creek through the open window and the small sounds of their children waking in the back of the house and the coffee going warm in their cups. James came into the kitchen at that moment with the hair of someone who had slept extremely hard and the expression of someone who is already thinking about the day's first task, which at 9 years old was usually something involving horses. He looked at his parents and recognized that something was happening, and proceeded to the coffee pot with the tact of a boy who has learned when to give people a moment. Catherine followed shortly after, her dark hair already neatly brushed because she brushed it first thing every morning before anything else, a habit that she had developed at age 3 and maintained without exception. She saw the flowers on the table and said, "Those are the creek flowers," with the precision of a child who pays attention. "They are," Susan said. "Papa brings those," Catherine said, pouring herself a small cup of heavily sweetened coffee which she had been allowed since her 6th birthday in a diluted form that had grown gradually less diluted. "He does," Susan said. Catherine looked at Frank with the evaluating expression she had used since infancy. "Every day," she said. "Every day," Frank said. Catherine appeared to file this away in whatever internal system she used for information she considered important, and then asked James to pass the bread. And the morning became a morning, with its ordinary things, and Susan sat in the middle of it, and thought that this was the whole of it, the ordinary morning with the extraordinary foundation beneath it, and that she would not trade a single piece, not the grief that had preceded it, not the 9 months of flowers before she had known. Not the awkward coffee in the early morning, not the Sunday walks or the Christmas social or the April garden or any of it, because all of it was what had made this morning exactly this. The years that followed were good years. James at 12 and 13 became the kind of young man who was recognizable as the child of both his parents, with Susan's directness and Frank's steadiness, and a talent with horses that was all his own, and which he was beginning to understand as a possible life rather than just a passion. Catherine at 10 and 11 was playing the church organ with a facility that made the congregation feel that God had sent them a particularly specific gift, and was also proving to be the child who would surpass her mother in school, not because Susan was any less a teacher, but because Catherine had a particular mathematical mind that Daniel Frost recognized and cultivated, and that was going to take her somewhere none of them could quite see yet. Susan and Frank grew into the kind of couple that long-term love makes when it is tended with honesty and respect, and the willingness to keep choosing, to sit across a kitchen table after 10 years, and mean it when you say every morning. There was nothing flashy about them, no grand demonstrations, no public declarations beyond the ordinary ones. What there was the daily choosing, the flowers on the porch, the hand across the table, the porch in the evening, the full lamp in the kitchen and both of them reading, and the sound of children sleeping in the back of the house. Harlan's Creek grew around them, as towns do, becoming more itself with each year, the buildings more permanent, the roads more traveled, the population more varied as the railroad brought commerce, and the commerce brought people. Some of what came was good and some was complicated, and some required the community to do the difficult work of deciding what kind of place it intended to be. Susan was part of those decisions, through the school and through the quiet, persistent voice of a woman who had been there long enough and thought carefully enough to be heard when she spoke. Frank was part of them too, in his way, the man who was there when it mattered and said what needed to be said without needing to say more. On the morning of the 25th of June, 1893, which was the 14th anniversary of their wedding, Susan Sullivan Keller opened her front door at dawn and found flowers on the porch. Yellow wildflowers from the creek, tied with rough twine, exactly as they had been on the first morning in 1878, exactly as they were on every morning that mattered and most mornings that did not, because that was the point, because there did not need to be a reason beyond the choosing. She picked them up and held them and looked down the road where Frank had long since gone in to start the morning's work, and the day was already beginning its long, slow warming toward the summer heat, and the creek was audible through the cottonwoods, and the house behind her held all the evidence of everything they had made together, and Susan Sullivan stood on the porch of the life she had built and felt it completely, the whole of it at once, forward and back, and she was not afraid of any of it. She went inside and put the flowers in the pottery jar that was still the same pottery jar, old and a little chipped now but still there, because some things you keep not because they are perfect but because they are yours, and she put the coffee on and listened to the house wake up around her. And when Frank came in from the corrals 20 minutes later with dirt on his boots and hay in his hair, and the particular quietness of a man who is completely at home, she handed him his coffee and he took it and touched her hand in the passing, just briefly, just the familiar warmth of his fingers over hers. And that was it, that was all of it, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly everything.